Well, thanks very much, Laura. Thanks, Morris. Thanks, the sponsors and directors of the Press Club for this opportunity to speak to the Press Club for the fourth time this parliamentary term. For the first, but hopefully not the last time, in this grand and auspicious Great Hall. Recognising that the history of this place is just a tiny speck on tens of thousands of years of the world's oldest continuous culture. Acknowledging the customs, elders and traditions of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people and all the First Nations. And proud that an Albanese Labor government will implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. Now, Anthony will be joining us shortly, and I'm grateful that he is, but also I'm especially grateful that he has given me the opportunity to work with a really outstanding group of colleagues in our economic team. And I wanted to acknowledge in particular Katie Gallagher, who's here, and also outstanding colleagues and friends like Stephen Jones and Matt Thistlethwaite and Andrew Lee, who make up our economic team. And also to work with other colleagues in the Shadow Cabinet and in the Parliament who have joined us here today. Penny Wong, Michelle Rowland, Brendan O'Connor, Christina Keneally, Raf Ciccone, Marielle Smith, Louise Pratt, Christy McBain, Sue Lyons, Daniel Molino, David Smith, Alicia Payne. Thank you so much. What a great squad for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And also great leaders, outstanding leaders in our federation, like Andrew Barr, the Treasurer of the ACT, also the Chief Minister of the ACT. And I know that you've got Mally here tomorrow as well, which is going to be a really terrific opportunity to speak to him as well. And in thanking all of my team here today as well, and my team in Logan Central at home and here in Canberra, can you just indulge me for a moment as I say how delighted I am that Barb Peeney is with us here today. Now, yeah. So Barb has worked for Labor frontbenchers for 35 years, but hasn't been to one of these for about 20 years. So I'm really pleased that Barb has joined us. On you, Barb. Now, on the face of it, the frantic last few days before an election's called might not seem an ideal time to take a step back for a moment, to take stock of our economy, our country, or our future. But with so much at stake, I think it's the perfect time, because we have learned so much about ourselves. We've learned from the mediocrity we had before the pandemic, the catastrophe we had during it, and the uncertainty that we're experiencing now. From floods and fire, a pandemic, a war in Europe, before that from the first recession in 30 years and another deep and damaging downturn just last year. From the false starts and the false dawns of this recovery, marred by policy mistakes and missteps. From a nation which rose to the occasion each time it needed to, and a government that fell back into old habits. A people who were there for each other at every single turn, and a Prime Minister who went missing, taking credit but never taking responsibility. And now, after 9 long years, 3 Treasurers and 3 Prime Ministers, the verdict is in. Average economic growth at 2.3% under this Liberal national government each year, lower than the 2.5% of the last Labor government. Average productivity growth at 1.1% a year under them versus 1.4% under us. Average wage growth, 2.1% a year under this government, but 3.6% under us. Average business investment, negative 2.8% a year compared with 5.5% under Labor. Average unemployment at 5.7% under this government versus 5.1% under its Labor predecessor. Multiplying debt and deficits as far as the eye can see. Fact after fact after fact, speaking to this one disappointing truth. This has been a wasted decade of missed opportunities, of families falling further and further behind, weighed down by skyrocketing costs of living and falling real wages. And now, not even a recovering economy or a recovering budget or high commodity prices, an unemployment rate falling in welcome ways, not even the skills shortages that come along with that, have brought decent wages growth. And shouting louder and louder at Australians about how great they've got it and how grateful they should be doesn't actually make it true. So if the looming election meant that the budget couldn't be an act of contrition, it should have at least been an act of recognition. Not just recognition of today's pressures, but recognition that those pressures existed well before the pandemic. An act of understanding that we can't have a better future if we double down and double back on the failed policies of the recent past. An acknowledgement that 9 years of waste and rorts in the budget and mismanagement of the economy have delivered the worst wages growth of any government ever, the weakest business investment and productivity outcomes of the last 30 years, the worst set of books ever presented to the people at an election, a budget riddled with rorts and chock full of wasteful spending, a treasurer personally culpable for tens of billions of dollars of emergency support for businesses which didn't need it, another $5.5 billion wasted on subs that will never be built, sports rorts, car park rorts, dodgy land deals, the list goes on. And when Josh Frydenberg said from this lectern 6 days ago that his main focus was on winning the election, and when Scott Morrison talks about the budget being a shield, they gave the game away. This was a budget designed to shield a government from the people. All about setting the coalition up for a fourth term, not setting our country up for a better future. That's why it's a budget unworthy of the Australian people, the sacrifices they've made and the struggles that we've endured. A budget unfit for the scale and the scope and the severity of the challenges our country and our world are grappling with. Australians deserved so much better, and the challenges of the moment demanded so much more. Because at their best, budgets bind together a government's agenda and they lay the foundations for the future. They should be the how in the story, the clear and compelling proof of how a party's promises and plans will matter for real people. A budget should embrace the big task of finding a place for everyone in the unfolding story of national economic success. Think of it this way. This huge tapestry over here that Arthur Boyd produced for this room is not a traditional landscape. It's a close-up of bushland. And apparently the impression that he wanted to leave was of a story in the middle of its telling. A story of vivid detail, clear and creative direction, but a destination not ever finally reached. No rest, no end. And governing is a bit like that as well. We should always be in the middle of the story, by which I mean we should be prepared to embark on new initiatives, knowing we may not be around to take credit for their success. That's the weight of responsibility and the generational perspective that a budget should carry. And that's the approach I want to take as Treasurer. Instead, last week we got a document that gloried in its shallowness and wallowed in its triviality. Deliberately, overtly, insultingly conceived as a prop for the election. And celebrated by the Liberals and Nationals not for what it would do for the country, but just for giving them something to say in their ads. Last week's budget showed exactly what sort of campaign Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg will run. Glib, incoherent, in denial of reality, and completely silent on the future. No ambition beyond their own survival. No vision beyond election night. And we have to expect more than that from government. If last week had seen a Labor budget handed down, it would have offered hope and support and resources to communities cleaning up floodwaters and rebuilding after bushfires. It would have delivered a plan for cheaper childcare and stronger wages growth, easing families off that punishing treadmill of rising prices and flatlining pay. It would have invested in Australian skills, small businesses and local supply chains to grow our self-reliance and our resilience and make our future here in Australia. It would have put an end to 9 years of stupendous rorts, abuse and waste and funded a national anti-corruption commission. It would have invested in productivity so we can grow the economy more strongly without runaway inflation. And as Anthony made clear, in a way that we're all incredibly proud of, a Labor budget and a Labor government would fix the crisis in aged care. Now, this is the least we can do for older Australians and the workers who care for them. Because through everything the world has thrown at Australia over the past few years, our people have shown their best qualities. But this budget showcases the government's worst instincts: self-obsessed, short-term, and out of touch with reality. A $103.6 billion improvement in the budget, courtesy of commodity prices and automatic stabilisers, but still $1.169 trillion worth of generational debt without a generational dividend. Another promise of wages growth, hoping that people would forget they've been wrong 52 of the other 55 times they've forecasted. Now, we know that prices for essentials like petrol, rent and childcare were already skyrocketing even before Russia invaded Ukraine, while Australians' real wages were going backwards. And we understand, of course, the invasion exacerbates this, and it feeds into global investor uncertainty, which had only just begun to recover in the aftermath of the pandemic and the recession. We recognise geopolitical risks aren't just rising in Europe, but closer to home as well. And as we consider the implications for our national security and for our economy from a Chinese leadership which is becoming not just more assertive in tone, but more aggressive in posture. And just the other day, factory activity in China slumped at its sharpest pace in 2 years, reminding us that the global health uncertainty from the pandemic still isn't over. We've all heard the Reserve Bank Governor warn that interest rates will rise before long, no matter who wins the election, driving up the costs of borrowing for families, businesses and governments. Now, the wrong and risky response to this uncertainty, to this context and this backdrop, is to continue on the current course and cling to the status quo. The most damaging thing that Australia could do right now, the biggest economic and social harm we could inflict, would be to accept flatlining wages, soaring prices, tepid investment and weak growth as our best case scenario, our new normal. That's not stability, that's stagnation. Now, the warnings have been there and they've been ignored for some time. Australians have already paid too much for this complacency. From a lack of disaster mitigation to a bungled vaccine rollout and a rapid testing debacle which emptied our supermarkets. Cost of living pressures haven't just shown up out of the blue. They aren't just a consequence of Russia invading Ukraine, they're a consequence of the coalition attacking wages and job security. That's why the relief in this budget isn't even enough to make up for the more than $3,200 fall in real wages for the average worker these past 2 years. But of all the failures in this budget, all the drift and disappointment of the 8 before it, the most glaring omission by far is the future. Again, the warnings were plain for all to see, this time in the government's own intergenerational report. It said if we do nothing to arrest our decline, we face an economy that's smaller than expected, growing slower than before, and saddled with at least 4 more decades of debt and deficits. And that's before we even factor in lower productivity growth at the average of the most recent cycle under the coalition. In that more realistic case, the economy would be almost 10% smaller by 2060, and Australians would be $32,000 worse off each on average. In the budget over the same time frame, the deficit will be 2.2 percentage points bigger and net debt will be 22.7 percentage points higher than the substantial debt and deficits forecast already. So Australians can't afford this complacency that's characterised the Liberal and National approach to the economy now for the best part of a decade. And that's why we've said if we are successful at the election, we'll hand down a proper budget this year. One which will implement our commitments, put in place our economic strategy and begin the hard work of dealing with a legacy of wasteful and rorted spending. And today, in giving you a sense of that, you'll see what the first half of a first term in my portfolio might look like if we're successful. The economic strategy, the fiscal strategy that will run alongside our white paper on the labour market and our review of the Reserve Bank and the intersection of fiscal and monetary policy. But one belief unites our whole approach. That's that an economy and a society stronger after COVID than before is within our reach. Our plan for economic growth invests in the future, targets cost of living pressures, and supports sectors that will improve our lives, create more secure new jobs, and grow our economy. Each of our investments are designed for a generational dividend and not just a 6 to 7 week political payoff. Instead of a panicked political pamphlet, we offer a plan, and it's got 5 parts. A Powering Australia policy to get energy costs and emissions down as we transition to new sources of cleaner energy. Hundreds of thousands of fee-free TAFE places to address the skills shortages acting as a handbrake on our economy. Cheaper, more accessible childcare to build a bigger workforce, able to work more and earn more if people choose to. More modern infrastructure, including key investments in upgrading the NBN and the digital economy. And a future made in Australia, made possible by smart co-investments in crucial sectors like manufacturing and the care economy, and boosting the resilience of small business. Now, this 5-point plan will lift the productive capacity of the economy and lift the speed limits on growth without adding unnecessarily to inflationary pressures. It will help create the more secure work and the stronger wages growth that we need by training people for higher wage opportunities, making it easier for mums and dads to go back to work, and by ensuring we're dealing with issues around labour hire, the gig economy, and casualisation, which have undermined wages now for too long. So much of what we propose will deliver more than one benefit to our economy, to its workers, families, and employers as well. For example, investing in cleaner and cheaper energy will cut emissions, but it will also cut power bills by $275 a year by 2025, unlock $76 billion of investment, and create over 600,000 jobs, most of these in the regions. Fee-free TAFE and more university places will equip Australians with critical skills, and that'll go some way to addressing those crippling shortages which are holding so many Australian businesses back. The TAFEs and universities add billions to the economy each year, but they also help Australians take advantage of the best opportunities. For example, Deloitte has recently found average digital skills are attracting a wage premium of around 9%, equivalent to an extra $7,700 per worker every year. Upgrading the NBN could help us capture a digital opportunity which Alpha Beta has estimated could be worth $207 billion in GDP per year by 2030 if Australia caught up to global leaders. But it will also make it easier for Australians to decide how they work and where they work from in the post-pandemic economy. A future made in Australia with procurement and co-investment plans will create new jobs and revitalise our regions with new industries and more opportunities in more parts of Australia. But it will also help shore up our supply chains and make them more resilient. Cheaper childcare will boost GDP from higher participation by at least 3 times as much as the government's alternative. But it's also great for kids. It helps alleviate cost pressures on working parents. And our aged care policy is all about doing the right thing for older Australians and those who care for them. But again, there's an economic dividend that flows from investment in such a big part of the care economy. Last year, after the steady growth of the past decade, the health and social assistance sector made the second biggest contribution to GDP of any industry. 10 years ago, it wasn't even in the top 5. And when it comes to aged care specifically, the sector employs close to 400,000 Australians, generates tens of billions of dollars in wages paid, in total revenue, and in GDP value added every year. So the point I'm making is that each element of our plan reinforces another. Our policies were designed and developed together, and they work together as a coherent strategy in pursuit of clear objectives. That's the product of 103 hours so far of careful, considered deliberations of our Shadow Expenditure Review Committee this term. And it's what bang for buck looks like. Instead, in the budget, we get cash shovelled in the general direction of voters in the hope that they'll forget a decade of flatlining living standards from the most wasteful government since Federation. And to paraphrase another Queenslander, I say this to Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg. This reckless rorting and wasteful spending must stop. If it's not the time to flick the switch to austerity, it is the time to flick a switch to quality, to smart investments in our future. Because the best way to repair the budget is to get the economy growing in a broader, more sustainable, more inclusive way. Now, contrast the bleak picture from the intergenerational report with the opportunities before us if we choose the right path. PwC has estimated with growth just 0.5% higher per year than what is currently projected, the structural deficit will close and would reach zero net debt 15 years earlier than currently anticipated. And that's why we want to be judged on the quality of our spending to the extent that it delivers the right kind of growth. We will be investing where it counts to create more opportunities, unlock business investment and drive productivity. This has never been more important than right now, where we know that our economic pressures lie on the supply side. That's why the quality of spending matters as much as the quantity. We are acutely aware of rate hike risks and what this means for household and federal budgets. The Commonwealth Bank's latest forecasts are that a cash rate of around 2.5%, in line with market pricing, will push mortgage payments as a share of household disposable income to a record high. This reflects the worsening housing affordability under the Liberals and the record household debt-to-income ratio, which has increased by 20 percentage points after remaining stable during Labor's last term. We know that rising mortgages are bound to impact the recovery and the comfort of households in deploying that $250 billion worth of savings on their balance sheets. So we take these risks seriously. But when you take two of our largest budget commitments so far in childcare and aged care, together, they make up only 1/5 of the government's new spending decisions that they unveiled in their latest budget. To put that into context, by 2025-26, our biggest commitments will make up only 0.3% of GDP spread over the next 4 years. In comparison, the government's decisions in this year alone are larger at 0.4% of GDP and represent around 1.5% of GDP over the forward estimates. So we maintain that our approach is necessary and responsible and right for the economic conditions. And so is our fiscal strategy. Grow the economy the right way, focus on quality and bang for buck, end the rorts and waste, and work with other countries to make sure that multinationals pay their fair share of tax in Australia where they make their profits. And when it comes to value for money, it's hard to think of a better investment than in aged care. And for those of you who've been tempted to write of the blurred differences between the major parties, I offer you this as an example of one of the defining distinctions between the big parties. It's been disappointing but not really surprising to see the lengths this government will go to deny people decent care, decent food and decent wages. Now, I know they think they're on a winner when they talk about the price that we are willing to pay for tangible improvements in the lives of older Australians and the working lives of those who care for them. But obviously, firstly, our plan is fully costed. But secondly, do they actually hear themselves when they ask these questions? When they say that $2.5 billion is too high a price to pay to spare older Australians from neglect and abuse and starvation? And even if somehow you could put that moral calculation aside, every time we're asked how we'll pay for important investments in our economy, such as childcare or aged care, remember this: the government just spent $39 billion in a budget without offsetting it. They talk about temporary spending, but they've opened up a structural deficit that will see something like 0.7% of GDP in 2032-33. They committed to $70 billion in spending between the December mid-year budget update and the March budget alone in 3 months. They wasted $5.5 billion on submarines that will never be built, more than twice the cost of our aged care plan. They've wasted at least $30 billion on other rorts, around 12 times the amount we propose to invest in extra support for aged care. So the election campaign that officially begins in a few days is an opportunity for a proper national conversation about all of these issues that I've touched on today. And I repeat my challenge to Josh Frydenberg to debate the budget and the economy and the future at least 3 times in this campaign. Here, in the West, anywhere that we can make it happen. He shouldn't hide behind scare campaigns or dishonest paid advertising or try to fight the 2019 election all over again. The campaign needs to be better than that. Because before Australians choose what kind of government they want, we first need to choose what kind of campaign we want. And when the Prime Minister spoke to you here in January, he said it wouldn't be a referendum, it would be a choice. But we know that it's both. A referendum on the past 10 years, which sifts through the rubble of the government's economic credibility and the shards of the Prime Minister's glass jaw. And a choice to be made about the next 10 years. The campaign to frame that decision can be a battle of one-liners, or it can be a contest of substance. It can be spin and marketing, or it can be real talk about what's confronting this country and what's at stake. Now, most of us in this room have roles to play in that. But in the end, what we say, how or whether you cover it, what you write or produce, is only one part of the big, shifting, sprawling conversation that every election represents. At a national and a local level, for communities and for individuals, a whole host of complexities will decide who Australians choose to govern them. And we know that whoever wins government on the 14th or the 21st of May, that when Australians wake up on the morning of the 15th or the 22nd, real wages will be going backwards. Businesses will be short of staff, industries short of skills. Childcare fees and healthcare costs will be too high for too many people. There will be conflict and tension in the world, far away and closer to home. Our country will occupy a precarious place in global supply chains. There'll be $1 trillion in debt and not enough to show for it. Petrol prices and interest rates will be about to rise again no matter who wins. A long rebuild ahead in places like Lismore and beyond. But what I also know is that if people wake up with a new Labor government, then for the first time in 9 years, there'll be a Prime Minister, a Treasurer, a Cabinet and a government with a determination and resolve and a sense of responsibility to actually start dealing with these challenges. And there will be a government that has the plans for a better future, for a stronger, more resilient, more inclusive, more sustainable economy that creates opportunities and puts those opportunities within the reach of more people. Because we want to run this country, its economy, in the interests of its people. A people who are like Arthur Boyd's tapestry in the middle of our story. The election will be tough and it will be close. And the path beyond that is challenging too. So we're not here to muck around or muddle through. A better future depends on it. Thanks very much, and I look forward to your questions.